The statesmen who assembled in Vienna to discuss how to design a peaceful order had been through a whirlwind of upheavals, overturning nearly every established structure of authority. In the space of 25 years, they had seen the rationality of the Enlightenment replaced by the passions of the Reign of Terror, the missionary spirit of the French Revolution transformed by the discipline of the conquering Bonapartist empire. French power had waxed and waned. It had spilled across France's ancient frontiers to conquer almost all of the European continent, only to be nearly extinguished in the vastness of Russia. The French envoy at the Congress of Vienna represented in his person a metaphor of the era's seemingly boundless upheavals. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, or Talleyrand as he was known, was ubiquitous. He started his career as Bishop of Autun, left the church to support the revolution, abandoned the revolution to serve as Napoleon's foreign minister, abandoned Napoleon to negotiate the restoration of the French monarch, and appeared in Vienna as Louis XVIII's foreign minister. Many called Talleyrand an opportunist. Talleyrand would have argued that his goals were stability within France and peace in Europe, and that he had taken whatever opportunities were available to achieve these goals. He had surely striven for positions to study the various elements of power and legitimacy at close hand without being unduly constrained by any of them. Only a formidable personality could have projected himself into the center of so many great and conflicting events. At Vienna, Talleyrand's contribution was to achieve for France a peace that preserved the ancient frontiers, which existed when it had started its foreign adventures. And within less than 3 years, in 1818, he managed France's entry into the Quadruple Alliance. The vanquished enemy would become an ally in the preservation of the European order in an alliance originally designed to contain it. A precedent followed at the end of World War II, when Germany was admitted to the Atlantic Alliance. The order established at the Congress of Vienna was the closest that Europe has come to universal governance since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. It produced a consensus that peaceful evolutions within the existing order were preferable to alternatives, that the preservation of the system was more important than any single dispute that might arise within it, that differences should be settled by consultation rather than by war. After World War I ended this vision, it became fashionable to attack the Congress of Vienna order as being excessively based on the balance of power, which, by its inherent dynamic of cynical maneuvers, drove the world into war. The British delegation asked the diplomatic historian C.K. Webster, who had written on the Congress of Vienna, to produce a treatise on how to avoid its mistakes. But that was true, if at all, only in the decade prior to World War I. The period between 1815 and the turn of the century was modern Europe's most peaceful, and the decades immediately following the Congress of Vienna were characterized by an extraordinary balance between legitimacy and power. The statesmen who assembled in Vienna in 1815 14 were in a radically different situation from their predecessors who drafted the Peace of Westphalia. A century and a half earlier, a series of settlements of the various wars that made up the 30 Years' War was conjoined with a set of principles for the general conduct of foreign policy. The European order that emerged took as its point of departure the political entities that existed, now separated from their religious impetus. The application of Westphalian principles was then expected to produce a balance of power to prevent or at least mitigate conflict. Over the course of the next nearly century and a half, this system had managed to constrain challengers to the equilibrium through the more or less spontaneous alignment of countervailing coalitions. The negotiators at the Congress of Vienna faced the wreckage of this order. The balance of power had not been able to arrest the military momentum of the revolution or of Napoleon. The dynastic legitimacy of government had been overwhelmed by Napoleon's revolutionary elan and skilled generalship. A new balance of power had to be constructed from the wreckage of the state system and of the Holy Roman Empire, whose remnants Napoleon had dissolved in 1806, bringing to a close 1,000 years of institutional continuity, and amidst new currents of nationalism unleashed by the occupation of most of the continent by French armies. That balance had to be capable of preventing a recurrence of the French expansionism that had produced near a hegemony for France in Europe, even as the advent of Russia had brought a similar danger from the East. Hence, the Central European balance also had to be reconstructed. The Habsburgs, once the continent's dominant dynasty, were now ruling only in their ancestral territories from Vienna. These were large and polyglot, roughly present-day Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, and southern Poland, and now of uncertain political cohesion. Several of the smaller German states, whose opportunism had provided a certain elasticity to the diplomacy of the Westphalian system in the 18th century, had been obliterated by the Napoleonic conquests. Their territory had to be redistributed in a manner compatible with the refound equilibrium. The conduct of diplomacy at the Congress of Vienna was fundamentally different from 21st century practice. Contemporary diplomats are in immediate, real-time contact with their capitals. They receive minutely detailed instructions down to the texts of their presentations. Their advice is sought on local conditions, much less frequently on matters of grand strategy. The diplomats at Vienna were weeks away from their capitals. It took 4 days for a message from Vienna to reach Berlin, so at least 8 days to receive a reply to any request for guidance. 3 weeks for a message to reach Paris. London took a little longer. Instructions, therefore, had to be drafted in language general enough to cover changes in the situation, so the diplomats were instructed primarily on general concepts and long-term interests. With respect to day-to-day tactics, they were largely on their own. Tsar Alexander I was 2 months from his capital, but he needed no instructions. His whims were Russia's commands, and he kept the Congress of Vienna occupied with the fertility of his imagination. The Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich, perhaps the shrewdest and most experienced statesman at Vienna, said of Alexander that he was too weak for true ambition, but too strong for pure vanity. Napoleon said of Alexander that he had great abilities, but that something was always missing in whatever he did. And because one could never foresee which particular piece would be missing in any given instance, he was totally unpredictable. Talleyrand was more blunt. He was not for nothing the son of the mad Char Paul.